Well, here we are. We're on week 4 of the story. Week 4 of the story. We're beginning the story of Moses, which we will dive into over the next couple weeks. And as you read through the story this week, you'll be going through the book of Exodus. But today we're going to get into Acts chapter 7. It's actually a New Testament passage. So turn to Acts chapter 7. We'll be there momentarily. Before we get there, we've got a little video that we'd like to share with you to get us ready for the story of Moses and the deliverance of Israel. All this week, talking about the deliverance of Israel under Moses. So this is chapter 4 of the story. Again, it'll be Exodus chapters 1 through 7, Exodus 10 through 17 when you're reading, when you're in your small groups. But this morning, we're going to be in Acts chapter 7. So please turn to Acts chapter 7, right around verse 20. That's where we'll be. But before we get into Acts chapter 7, there's a great quote from Dwight L. Moody about Moses, and I'd like you to look at it on the screen. This is probably one of the best quotes that's not in the Bible about Moses. Dwight L. Moody said that Moses spent his first 40 years of his life thinking he was somebody. He spent the next 40 years, the second 40 years, learning that he was nobody, and the last 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. So that's a great outline of Moses' life. Thought he was somebody, found out he was nobody, and then spent the last 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. And that's basically what we want to look at today. We're going to look at Moses' life through Dwight L. Moody's breakdown of his life. He thought he was somebody, found out he was nobody, and then learned what God can do with a nobody. So that's how we'll look at Moses' life today. And if you think about it, Moses is one of the 3 great heroes of the Old Testament. You have Abraham, David, and Moses. They're like the big 3 in the Old Testament. So he's a very well-known character, a well-known figure in the Old Testament. And Moses' story covers the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. 4 books of the Old Testament tell Moses' story, which you could compare that to the story of Jesus. The life of Christ is basically in 4 books of the Bible as well. The 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But what happens if you put Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy side by side with the Gospels? You'll find out that Moses' story is a lot longer than the story of Jesus. There are 137 chapters in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. 137. In the Gospels, there's only 89. So Moses has a lot written about him and written by him in the Old Testament. So in order to have a greater appreciation of what he wrote and his story, we're actually going to step outside of his works, outside of those books, and look at Acts chapter 7. Acts chapter 7 is a sermon by Stephen, who was a deacon in the early church. And it's a great message about the Old Testament, and he spends a lot of his message talking about Moses. So that's where we'll be. Stephen's message in Acts chapter 7, starting in verse 20. We'll do about 2 or 3 verses at a time. But we're going to start in Acts chapter 7, verses 20 and 21. Way back when Moses thought he was somebody. When Moses thought he was somebody. Acts chapter 7, verses 20 and 21. At that time Moses was born, and he was no ordinary child. For 3 months he was cared for by his family. When he was placed outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him and brought him up as her own son. Now, when you read these verses, you find out here's the beginning of Moses' problem. Moses' problem is this. He was not an Egyptian. He was not an Egyptian. He was adopted into Pharaoh's family, but he was still a foreigner in Pharaoh's family. He was adopted into Pharaoh's family. He's not really an Egyptian. Deep down inside, he is an Israelite. Deep down inside, he is related and connected to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Do you remember what we read last week, what we talked about last week? How Joseph brought his family down to Egypt. There was a great family reunion in Egypt. And Joseph was basically ruling over all of Egypt. Well, he died and the Pharaoh died. And then the Israelites end up in slavery for 400 years. So no longer do they have somebody ruling their country. They are now slaves in Egypt, and they've been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And Moses is around 40 years old when he decides it's time for me to no longer be part of Pharaoh's household. I need to go back to my own people, the Israelites. I need to remember that I'm a slave, that I belong to Israel. I don't belong to Egypt, and I don't belong to Pharaoh. Because sometimes when people hit the age of 40, they have what we call a midlife crisis. Moses was only a third of the way through his life, so it wasn't a midlife crisis, but it was an identity crisis. He's like, I'm not an Egyptian. I'm not part of Pharaoh's family. I belong with the people of Israel. And here's what it says, Hebrews 11, verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. There came a point in time when Moses said, I don't want to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter anymore. I don't belong to Pharaoh. I belong to Israel. That's where I belong. I belong with my people, whether they are slaves or not. He was born an Israelite, but he was raised and dressed and trained to be an Egyptian. In fact, that's what it says in the next verse in Acts chapter 7, verse 22. Acts 7, 22 and 23. Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. So think about when God called Moses, the burning bush, and all that wonderful story that we have in Exodus chapter 3 and 4, which maybe you've already read it, or you might read it today or some point during this week. One of the excuses that Moses made to God was that I am slow of speech and tongue. You know, God told Moses, you're going to be my spokesman, you're going to be my mouthpiece, you're going to be speaking on my behalf. And Moses said, Lord, I'm slow of speech and tongue. Now in the New Testament it says, he was powerful in speech and action. So which is it? Was he slow of speech and tongue, or was he powerful in speech and action? I'd like to believe this, that he was powerful in speech. I think he was making an excuse to try to get out of serving God in the book of Exodus. In fact, he made 5 excuses to try to get out of it way back in the book of Exodus. And that's a problem that we all have. We all have this same problem. It's not what we are that holds us back. It's what we think we're not. Right? How many times do we say, I can't do that? I'm no good at that. Never even tried it. We would say, I can't do that. I'm not good at that. I would not do well if I gave that a shot. And that's what Moses was doing to God. That's what I believe. That's just my opinion. Because later on here in Acts chapter 7, it says he was powerful in speech and action. Now maybe part of his problem is that he's now 80 years old when we come to this spot, and he spent 40 years with the sheep, so maybe 40 years with the sheep. He's not as good of a public speaker as he thought he was. You know, he's used to communicating with sheep, and his vocal ability has declined. I don't know. But he's making an excuse before God. So he was powerful in speech, and he was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, which is wonderful. But what about the history of his people? The history of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Moses is basically an Israelite in Egyptian clothing. That's who he is at this point in his life. He's an Israelite in Egyptian clothing. He could have stayed in Egypt and chose fame and fortune and power, but he rejected those things. That's what the New Testament tells us. He rejected all the things of Egypt because he wanted to be with his own people. He wanted to visit his own people, the Israelites. And his choice changed history. If Moses didn't make this choice, we wouldn't be talking about him today. But he made the choice. He chose Israel over Egypt. Because if Moses chose Egypt, you know what we would say about him today? We would say he's just a mummy in a tomb. We would say, hey, there's King Tut, and there's Ramses, and there's Moses. Just another mummy in a tomb in Egypt. But he did not choose Egypt. He chose Israel. He did not choose Egypt. He chose God. He exchanged his scepter in Pharaoh's palace for a shepherd's staff. He said no to the throne of Egypt, but he said yes to the ultimate throne, which was the throne of God. And very quickly he found out that once he rejected Egypt, all of a sudden he was a nobody. Thought he was somebody the first 40 years, but he rejected all that and he was willing to become a nobody. Look at what it says in Acts chapter 7, verse 24. Acts chapter 7, verses 24 and 25. He's a nobody now. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. Moses thought that his own people would realize that God was using him to rescue them, but they did not. See, Moses realizes God has called me to do more than just be a leader in Egypt. He wants me to deliver the Israelites. So he figures, day one, here we go. Here's the best opportunity. I have an Israelite versus an Egyptian. Who do I side with? Who do I defend? I'm going to defend the Israelites. So what did he do? Killed the Egyptian. Now we read this very casually, right? We just read over it and we just keep on going. You know, when was the last time you walked up to two people arguing and said, I'll just kill one and end the argument, right? That's what Moses did. He came to his defense. He defended the Israelite by killing the Egyptian. And he thought, everybody's going to realize that I'm here to rescue them. I'm not only here to rescue one Israelite, I'm here to rescue all of the Israelites. But they didn't realize that. They did not recognize that at all. Watch what goes on in verse 26. The next day Moses came upon two Israelites who were fighting. He tried to reconcile them by saying, men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other? But the man who was mistreating the other pushed Moses aside and said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday? When Moses heard this, he fled to Midian, where he settled as a foreigner and had 2 sons. So day one, Israelite versus Egyptian, easy. Kill the Egyptian, defend the Israelite. Day 2, a little more difficult. Israelite versus Israelite. They're arguing with each other, fighting with one another. And I love what Moses said in verse 26. Men, you are brothers, why do you want to hurt each other? Man, there's a question that a lot of churches need to ask themselves today. How many churches have fighting going on inside? And Moses would say, you're brothers, or you're brothers and sisters in Christ. Why do you want to hurt each other? Why does the church do this? Why are we guilty of friendly fire, hurting one another? So there were 2 Israelites fighting with each other, and we've told you before that always look for something new that you learn for the first time when you read through the story. And I never noticed this before till this past week. As Moses was trying to reconcile these 2 men, one of them pushed him aside. It got physical in a hurry. This man pushed Moses aside and said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Who said that you're in charge? So they're rejecting him. They're rejecting Moses as their deliverer. They didn't realize that Moses would rescue them. So he was pushed aside and rejected. So when the rescuer gets rejected, what does he do? Runs away. When the rescuer gets rejected, he runs away. And unfortunately, that's what people are doing with Jesus Christ in the world today. He's the rescuer. He's the one who's come to save them, right? But what do people do? They push him away. They reject him. And here's a verse just to make you think about that for a little bit. It comes from Philippians 3, verse 18. The words of the Apostle Paul. He said, for as I have often told you before, and now tell you again, even with tears, many live as enemies of the cross of Christ. You see what Paul said? He said, many people live as enemies of the cross of Christ. They've rejected God. They've rejected Jesus Christ. And Paul says, you know what? I've told you this time and time again, and it brings him to tears. And I don't know about you, but I know that I don't shed enough tears for people who still need Jesus Christ. Paul said, I'm weeping over the people who've rejected Jesus Christ. These people need Jesus, right? People in this verse, the people who are living as enemies of the cross of Christ today, the people in West Volusia who are enemies of Christ, you know who they need? Jesus. Where will they find Jesus? In you and me. We pray that they don't reject Jesus anymore. They rejected Jesus. They rejected Moses. And at this point in his life, Moses is 80 years old. 40 years old in Egypt, 40 years in the wilderness. Add it up, you have him at 80 years old when God called him. He was 80 years old when God appeared to him in that burning bush. And that's what we'll read in verse 30, Acts chapter 7, verse 30. Stephen breaks it down nice and clearly for us. Acts chapter 7, verse 30. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to Moses in the flames of a burning bush in the desert near Mount Sinai. When he saw this, he was amazed at the sight. As he went over to get a closer look, he heard the Lord say, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses trembled with fear and did not dare to look. So Moses is 80 years old. He's been shepherding sheep for 40 years. He realizes that he is a nobody. Nobody cares about Moses. His life feels meaningless at this point. He tried the deliverer thing. Day 1 worked well. Day 2 did not. So he ran away. Here he is, 80 years old, trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do with the rest of my life? God says, I'm going to tell you. And how did God appear to Moses? It's a very familiar story. In fact, many of you are picturing Charlton Heston in your head right now. If you weren't before, now you are. But how did God appear to Moses? How did God appear to Moses? Burning bush. And people ask, why was he attracted to a burning bush? Because Moses is a guy and guys like fire. That's why Moses went over to the bush. Hey, it's on fire. I'll go check it out. Guys like fire. Moses went over and checked it out. But this was different. This is not just a burning bush. He also hears the voice of the Lord. He hears the voice of the Lord. God says, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I believe this is the first time God has referred to himself by this name. All three. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Do you see what's going on here? A continuation of the story. It was Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were brought into this world. Why? To bless all nations by bringing Jesus into the world. Now Moses is coming along to deliver the Israelites out of Egypt. You see, the story is all connected together from front to back, from Genesis to Revelation. I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses was shepherding sheep when God called him, right? Moses was shepherding sheep when God called him. David was shepherding sheep when God called you. You want God to call you? Step 1, get some sheep. No, I don't know if you need to do that. But you know what you do need to do? You need to get into God's story. You want God to speak to you? Get into His Word. Get into His story. Take a look at verse 33. Acts chapter 7, verse 33. Then the Lord said to him, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I have indeed seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their groaning and have come down to set them free. Now come, I will send you back to Egypt. Why was it holy? Why was this ground holy? Because this is the place where Moses encountered God. And you've got to ask yourself, when was the last time that you encountered God? When was the last time that you encountered God? And I don't mean burning bushes and voices coming from heaven. But when was the last time you really encountered God? It doesn't have to be at camp or a conference or a convention. Any ground can be holy if you invite God in. Any ground can be holy if you invite God in. Do you know why the story is changing people in our church already? It's because when they're opening up that book and reading it on their own, they're inviting God in. They're inviting God into their lives, into their schedule, and when you let Him in, He changes things. It's not the same once you let God in. You can let God in wherever you want. You can let God into your classroom. You can let God into your car. You can let God into your cubicle. You can let Him in wherever you want. The place where you read the story in the morning or the evening, you can let God in there. You can let Him into the home where your small group meets. You can let Him into the spot where you pray. Because no matter what you do, when you invite God in, you know what God starts to do? He starts to work. He starts to work. And that's what God told Moses. God told Moses in verse 34, I've seen the oppression. I've heard their groaning. I have come down. I will send you back to Egypt. God says, we're going to get to work. I've seen it. I've heard it. I've come down. And I'm sending you to Egypt because you're going to be the guy who gets them out of slavery. Now, as people have read the story, people have lots of questions. Different questions pop up. And I was wondering this week, God, couldn't there have been somebody who rescued the Israelites out of Egypt after 50 years or 100 years or 200 or 300? Why did it have to be 400 plus years for Moses? But you know what? That's not up to me. That's not my call. God does not call me up for advice. Never has, never will. So we can't question God's plan. This was God's plan, and he stuck to it. He was going to bring them out of Egypt, and the one to do it would be Moses. Verse 35, Acts chapter 7, verse 35. This is the same Moses they had rejected with the words, "Who made you ruler and judge?" He was sent to be their ruler and deliverer by God himself, through the angel who appeared to him in the bush. He led them out of Egypt and performed wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness. This is the same Moses. How did it start out for him? Not very well, because they rejected him. Who made you ruler and judge? God says, I did. In fact, he's not ruler and judge. He will be your ruler and deliverer. You will not get out of Egypt without Moses. You will not escape Egypt without Moses. There is no exodus out of Egypt without Moses. He is the ruler and the deliverer. Verse 36, he led them out of Egypt, performed wonders and signs in Egypt. What were some of the wonders and signs he performed in Egypt? The 10 plagues. Oh man, that's a good story. That's a good story, because who goes head to head? Moses and Pharaoh's Egyptians, or not Pharaoh's Egyptians, Pharaoh's magicians. They go head to head. You know, Moses turns the water into blood. Pharaoh's magicians did the same thing. And that troubles people. If they had real power, they would have solved the problem, not made it worse. And then with the second plague, the plague of blood is first, then the plague of frogs. Moses brings frogs all over the land of Egypt, and Pharaoh's magicians did the same thing. You know what? They didn't need more frogs in Egypt, they needed less. And if Pharaoh's magicians had real power, they would have been able to get rid of the frogs. So they just made the problem worse. It was the third plague out of 10, where the magicians of Pharaoh were knocked out. They were knocked out in the third round. That's a pretty good boxing match, right? Knocked out in the third round by the plague of gnats. Moses struck the dust of the ground of Egypt, and it turned into gnats. A few of you are already cringing. All the dust of Egypt turned into gnats. Do that at your house sometime. Take your broomstick, whack it on the ground, and see if all the dust in your house turns into gnats. See how that goes. It wouldn't be a pretty picture. But Moses did this. Struck the ground, the dust turned to gnats, and the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Third plague, they were knocked out. Third plague, they were knocked out. Moses performed wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea. What did he do there? Raised his staff, 2 miracles in one. The waters parted and the ground was dry. 2 miracles in one. If it had been you and me, we would have parted the waters, but we would have forgotten about the ground. It would have been muddy and sticky and marshy and unable to pass through very easily, not very quickly, certainly. But God did 2 for 1. Parted the waters and dried the ground. He did miracles and wonders and signs in Egypt, at the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness. What were some of the miracles in the wilderness? Oh, manna from heaven, quail, water from the rock, the ground opens up and swallows people. It's good stuff. Moses is doing all these miracles because God's power is on him. God's hand is on him. In fact, remember, Pharaoh's magician said it was just the finger of God. It was just the finger of God. That's all God needed, was one little finger to deliver his people out of Egypt. Miracles in Egypt, the Red Sea, and for 40 years in the wilderness, which you'll read about over the next few weeks. Acts chapter 7, verse 37. This is the Moses who told the Israelites, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your own people. All right? God will raise up for you a prophet like me. Moses told the people that not long before he died. That comes from Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18. God's going to raise up for the people of Israel a prophet like Moses. So where can you find a prophet like Moses who can perform miracles and bring the law and deliver people out of bondage? There's only one prophet who can top Moses, and who is that? Jesus. So when Moses was speaking in Deuteronomy 18, who is he talking about? He's talking about Jesus. You see Jesus appearing in every chapter of the story so far. He appeared in the garden where God said Jesus would come along and crush the head of the serpent. And Jesus appears in the blessing to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where all nations will be blessed through you, because of you. by Jesus Christ. And then what did Jacob promise to Judah? What we read last week. That from his family, from the tribe of Judah, would become a leader and a ruler, and all the nations would obey him. Genesis 49, verse 10. Who is that? Jesus. He's been in every chapter of the story so far. Did you know Jesus was lurking in the Old Testament? He was there all along. He's been there all this time. And this is what happens when we get into God's story. We spend more time with God, then we end up knowing him more, and because we know him more, we love him more. And that's what's going on in people's hearts. That's what's going on in small groups. And that's what's going on in many of your lives as well. You spend more time with God, you know him more, and you love him more. Jesus is the only one who could top Moses. But Moses has a pretty good resume for himself. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. We call it the Law of Moses. He performed all those miracles which you'll read about. When Jesus went up on the Mount of Transfiguration, 2 Old Testament heroes appeared with Jesus. Elijah and Moses. Moses was there. So that's pretty good for a nobody. Dwight L. Moody said at the end he realized that he was just a nobody. But he did a lot for a nobody because God was with him. There's one more passage of Scripture I'd like you to realize, I'd like you to notice. And maybe it's something you've never realized before. This is the great thing about these biblical characters, these Old Testament characters. Their stories spill over into the New Testament. There's just so much to say about Abraham and Joseph and Moses. Their stories are all over the Bible. Acts chapter 7, Hebrews chapter 11, it's all over. But I want you to just listen to 2 verses from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 verses from 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 and 2. Paul wrote this, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea." You've heard this story before, right? When God led the people from Egypt, when he was leading them to the promised land, what did he do? He gave them a GPS, right? Well, sort of. There's a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That was above them all that time for 40 years. And it was above them just as clearly as this ceiling is above your head. The pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire was above them, and clearly, they could see it clearly every day for 40 years. Just as clearly as you can read Google Maps and follow your GPS or the navigation that's on your dashboard. Just as clearly as you can see that, they saw God above them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Is that true? Certainly. Certainly. God was their guide. Then in verse 2, Paul says this, "They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea." Did you know that Moses was baptizing people in the Old Testament? Not exactly. But the picture of them going through the Red Sea, going through the water, is symbolism. It's a symbol, it's a picture, it's a lesson for us today. If you're going to put your faith in Moses, way back in the book of Exodus, if you want to get out of slavery and bondage, what are you going to have to do? You're going to have to follow him through the water. Right? That's what God said. You want to get out of Egypt? You got to follow him through the water. Well, it's kind of scary, right? I mean, this is the Red Sea. It's at flood stage, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong. That might be the Jordan River in the book of Joshua. But it'd be a little intimidating walking through water that's standing up in 2 walls on their left and their right. I wouldn't want to do that. That would be scary. But God says, if you want to get out of Egypt and get to the promised land, if you want to get out of slavery and get to freedom, you know what you'll have to do? You have to go through the water. You have to pass through the water. You have to have faith in Moses and you have to follow him through the water. And the same goes for Jesus. If you want salvation, redemption, and freedom, you have to pass through the water. And that's what we call baptism. That's what God calls baptism. Because baptism identifies and unites us with God. They weren't necessarily baptized in the Red Sea, but they passed through the water. And it was like a baptism. Because when you pass through the water of baptism, whether it's in a baptistry, or a swimming pool, or in a river, or in an ocean, it doesn't matter. When you're baptized in the water, you have identified yourself with God, and you are now united with God. That's what happens. You have to pass through the water. And maybe today's the day for somebody here to do that, to pass through the water, to be set free, to be united with God. If that's the decision you need to make, we'll give you an opportunity to do that during our invitation song in just a moment.